I signed a 12-month lease on a two-bedroom apartment in Asheville, wired my first month's rent and security deposit to a property management company called Ridgeline Holdings, and thought nothing of the transaction beyond relief at finally finding a place my husband and I could afford after nearly 2 months of frustrating apartment hunting. 4 months later, the man who owned that building walked into my unit for a routine inspection, looked at the emergency contact listed on my lease application, and went completely still. My mother's name. He hadn't heard it spoken out loud in 22 years. If this story is already hitting you somewhere personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. My name is Piper Calloway. I'm 28 years old. This is what happened when the man who abandoned my mother and me when I was 6 years old turned out to be collecting my rent every month without either of us knowing it. Let me take you back to how we got to that apartment in Asheville, because the collision that happened in my living room that afternoon had been building for 22 years long before either of us understood we were standing on opposite sides of the same lease agreement. My father, Gregory Ashworth, left our family in the spring I turned 6. I don't remember the leaving itself clearly, mostly fragments a suitcase by the door, my mother's face doing something I didn't have language for, yet the specific silence of a house that had one fewer person in it than it did the day before. What I remember more clearly is the years that followed. My mother, Vivian Lang, working 2 jobs, a receptionist position during the day, and bookkeeping for a small accounting firm on weekends, raising me largely alone in a rented duplex in Knoxville, while my father, as far as either of us knew, simply disappeared into whatever life he built without us. I remember specific holidays more than I remember him honestly. Christmases, where my mother worked extra shifts leading up to the 25th, just to afford presents that looked like enough birthdays where the absence of a card felt louder than any card actually arriving would have. I remember asking her once around age 8 why my father didn't want to see me, and her sitting very still for a long moment, before saying carefully that it wasn't about wanting, it was about him not knowing how to want the right things. I didn't understand that answer at 8. I mostly understand it now. We heard almost nothing from him after that first year. A birthday card when I turned 9. No return address, the postmark from a city 3 states away, I didn't recognize. A single brief phone call when I was 14 that ended in an argument between him and my mother. I wasn't allowed to hear the details of only the raised voices through a closed bedroom door, followed by my mother emerging afterward with red eyes and a forced, unconvincing smile telling me everything was fine. By the time I was in college, I'd stopped thinking of him as a person I might ever see again, more like a fact about my childhood. I mentioned occasionally and quickly moved past in conversation, the way you'd mention a house fire from years earlier, real formative but no longer something with an active pulse in my present life. I married my husband Ethan Calloway 4 years ago, taking his last name partly out of genuine excitement and partly, I'll admit now, out of some small, unexamined relief at shedding a name that had never quite felt fully mine to begin with. Tangled up as it was with a father who'd made it clear through decades of silence that he didn't particularly want it carried forward on his behalf either. Ethan proposed at a small overlook outside Knoxville, where we'd had our first real date. Nothing elaborate, just the 2 of us and a ring he'd saved carefully for over 8 months. My mother cried at the wedding, happy tears mostly, though I caught her once during the reception, glancing toward the empty seat we'd left at her insistence, unlabeled, unclaimed, a small silent acknowledgement of who wasn't there. Ethan's job as a supply chain analyst relocated us to Asheville 18 months ago, and we spent nearly 2 frustrating months apartment hunting before finding a 2-bedroom unit on Haywood Street that fit our budget, $1,650 a month, managed by a company called Ridgeline Holdings, whose leasing office handled everything through a portal and a rotating cast of maintenance staff we rarely interacted with directly. The apartment search itself had been exhausting, 3 separate units falling through for various reasons, our savings account dwindling with each application fee until Haywood Street finally came through with an approval 2 days before our previous lease's grace period expired. I filled out the lease application the way you fill out any lease application, quickly, mechanically. Listing my mother, Vivian Lang, as my emergency contact, the way I had on every apartment application since I turned 18. Never once considering that the small routine detail would eventually matter more than anything else on the entire form. We moved in that March, unpacked slowly over a few exhausted weekends, hung curtains, argued good-naturedly about where the couch should go. I never once thought about who actually owned the building beyond the vague, unexamined assumption that it was some faceless investment group the way most renters assume about the entity cashing their monthly check. Small maintenance issues cropped up over those first 4 months the way they do in any older building, a leaking bathroom faucet in April, that took 3 visits to fully resolve a flickering hallway light in May, that turned out to be a wiring issue in the unit above ours, a dishwasher that stopped draining properly in June minor, and manageable individually, but accumulating into the kind of low-grade frustration every renter eventually knows. Each time I submitted a request through the property management portal, and each time a maintenance technician named Ray showed up within a few days, quiet and efficient, fixing what needed fixing without much conversation, beyond a polite greeting and a rundown of what he'd found. In July, the dishwasher issue resurfaced worse this time, water pooling on the kitchen floor after every cycle enough that I'd started running it only when Ethan or I could be home to monitor it. I submitted another request, more frustrated this time, mentioning in the notes field that this was the second time in 2 months and asking whether it might finally need replacing instead of another patch repair. 2 days later, I got an email, not from the usual maintenance scheduling account, but from a name I didn't recognize, Gregory Ashworth, listed as owner Ridgeline Holdings, apologizing personally for the recurring issue and saying he'd be stopping by himself that Thursday to assess whether the unit needed a full appliance replacement, a level of personal attention that struck me at the time as simply unusually good customer service. I didn't think anything of the name. Ashworth is common enough, and it had been 22 years since I'd had any reason to associate that particular combination of syllables with anything beyond a vague, distant unpleasantness. I rarely revisited anymore, filed away somewhere I'd stopped checking on. Thursday afternoon, I was home working remotely when the doorbell rang. I opened it to a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a simple button-down shirt, carrying a small toolbox and a clipboard. He introduced himself professionally pleasantly, the way landlords do when they're trying to make a good impression on a tenant they've personally inconvenienced. "Gregory Ashworth," he said, extending his hand. "Sorry again about the dishwasher. Let's take a look." I shook his hand, said something polite about appreciating him coming out personally, and led him to the kitchen. He knelt down, examined the appliance, made notes on his clipboard, asked a few practical questions about how long the leaking had been happening. Nothing about the interaction felt unusual right up until he stood, glanced at the clipboard again to confirm the unit number, and his eyes drifted almost absently to the printed lease summary attached to the back of his inspection form, the same form that listed my emergency contact information. I watched something shift in his face, subtle at first, like a man squinting to read something at a distance, then unmistakable. He went very still, staring at the page for several seconds longer than the information on it should have required. "Vivian Lang," he said quietly, not quite to me, more like he was testing whether saying it out loud would confirm or dissolve whatever he was suddenly thinking. "That's your emergency contact?" Something in his tone made my stomach tighten before I fully understood why. "That's my mother," I said carefully. "Why?" He looked up at me, then really looked in a way that felt different from anything in our brief interaction so far, searching my face for something specific, something he seemed to be finding piece by piece the longer he looked. "What's your date of birth?" he asked, his voice strange now, unsteady in a way it hadn't been a moment earlier. I told him, watching his face carefully as I did some instinct already assembling a shape I didn't want to name yet. "Piper?" he said. And the way he said my first name, not from the lease, which only listed my married name Calloway, told me before he said anything else exactly what was happening. "You're Piper." I set down the dish towel I'd been holding my hands, suddenly unsteady, the kitchen tile suddenly feeling less solid under my feet than it had a moment earlier. "How do you know my first name? It's not on any of the paperwork you're holding." He set the clipboard down on the counter carefully, like he needed both hands free for what he was about to say, or maybe just needed somewhere to put them that wasn't shaking. "Because I'm your father," he said. "Gregory Ashworth. I left when you were 6. I've spent 22 years wondering sometimes what happened to you and your mother, and I just spent the last 4 months collecting your rent without having any idea it was you." The kitchen went silent, except for the faint drip of the dishwasher he'd come to fix. I stood there processing something my brain seemed determined to reject, even as the evidence assembled itself in front of me, his face older than I remembered, but recognizable now that I was actually looking for it, a resemblance around the eyes I'd apparently inherited without ever knowing where it came from. The same slight furrow I saw in my own reflection whenever I was concentrating on something difficult. "You're my landlord," I said finally, the sentence sounding absurd even as I said it out loud like a sentence built from words that had no business sitting next to each other. "I'm your landlord." He confirmed, his voice unsteady in a way that suggested he was hearing the absurdity of it too in real time right alongside me. "I own 6 properties in this city, mostly through Ridgeline. I've never once looked closely at tenant files beyond approving the initial applications through my property manager, a formality I usually skim in about 30 seconds. I had no idea, Piper. I want you to know that. I would never have." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Something that looked genuinely like shock still settling over his features, his hand gripping the edge of the counter like he needed the support. Have you ever had 2 completely separate parts of your life collide by pure accident, forcing a reckoning neither of you were prepared for? Tell me in the comments, because I stood in my own kitchen that afternoon, feeling like the floor had quietly rearranged itself under me while I was busy thinking about dishwasher repairs. I asked him to leave that day. Not angrily, not shouting, just quietly, firmly, telling him I needed time before I could have any kind of real conversation with him, my voice steadier than I actually felt in that moment. He nodded, gathered his clipboard and toolbox, and left without argument, though he paused at the door and said, "I'll have someone else handle any maintenance requests going forward. You won't have to see me unless you want to." A small, unexpected consideration that stayed with me longer than I expected it to that night. I called Ethan the moment the door closed, my voice shaking through most of the explanation, pacing the length of our living room, as I tried to make the story sound as coherent out loud as it had felt chaotic in my own head. He came home early, sat with me on our couch while I processed something that felt simultaneously enormous and absurd, that the faceless entity we'd been paying rent to for 4 months had turned out to be the man whose absence had quietly shaped most of my childhood, sitting in our own kitchen not an hour earlier, holding a clipboard and a toolbox. Like nothing about the afternoon should have been remarkable at all. I called my mother that evening, unsure how to even begin the conversation, rehearsing the first sentence 3 times before I actually dialed. When I finally got the words out, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before she said quietly, "Of course it's him. Of course this is how the universe decided to do this." She laughed. Not quite a real laugh, more a sound of pure disbelief, the kind that comes from someone who's spent decades bracing for a reappearance that never came in any form she could have predicted. 22 years and he finds you through a dishwasher repair request. I researched Gregory Ashworth over the following days, the way you research anyone you're suddenly forced to reckon with his real estate holdings, a modest but genuine local reputation as a fair if quiet landlord, glowing enough reviews from other tenants that it almost felt disorienting to reconcile with the man who'd left us behind so completely. Buried in an old newspaper archive, a mention of the Ashworth Family Foundation, a small scholarship fund he'd apparently established years earlier for first-generation college students in the Knoxville area, quietly funded no press releases, no galas, just a modest annual award announced through a handful of local high school guidance offices. I stared at that detail for a long time before I remembered with a jolt that made me sit down at my own kitchen table that I'd received a $2,400 scholarship from an organization with almost that exact name during my sophomore year of college, a detail I'd filed away at the time as simply a stroke of unexpected luck. one small piece of financial relief during a year when my mother and I were counting every dollar between us. I called the foundation's administrator the next day. My voice, steadier than I expected, gave my name asked about the scholarship records from that year. She confirmed it matter-of-factly, reading off a small file Piper Lang, sophomore year, Knoxville, recommended for the award based on financial need and academic merit application, reviewed and personally approved by the foundation's founder. I sat with that information for a long time after hanging up, understanding that my father had, apparently without either of us knowing it quietly, funded a piece of my own education years before. A dishwasher ever brought us face to face, a strange, second-hand kind of presence I hadn't known to look for. I agreed to meet him properly 2 weeks later at a coffee shop downtown Neutral Ground, Ethan waiting in the car outside, in case I needed to leave quickly, a small, reassuring plan we'd worked out together the night before. Gregory arrived first, already seated, standing when he saw me the way you'd stand for someone you were nervous to disappoint, his hands fidgeting slightly with the edge of his coffee cup as I approached the table. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said before I'd even sat down, the words clearly rehearsed, though not in a way that made them feel insincere. "I just want to explain, if you're willing to hear it, not to excuse what I did, but because I think you deserve the actual reasons instead of just the absence." I let him talk. He told me about the person he'd been at 31, struggling with a business failure that had drained nearly everything he and my mother had saved, a marriage he felt trapped inside, during a period when he says he barely recognized his own reflection. A kind of cowardice he described plainly without softening it as choosing to run rather than face what staying would have required of him. He told me he'd tried twice over the years to reach out more substantially, once when I turned 16 and once around my college graduation, and both times lost his nerve at the last moment, convincing himself my mother and I were better off without the disruption of his reappearance, a rationalization he admitted sitting across from me now had mostly just protected him from having to face what he'd actually done. He told me about the scholarship fund, too. Admitted it had started in part as a way of doing something for children like the daughter he'd left, even if he couldn't yet face reaching out to that actual daughter directly. It felt like something he said quietly, staring down at his coffee. It wasn't enough. I understood that, even while I was doing it. But it felt like the only version of showing up I could manage without having to look you in the eye. "That's a strange kind of penance," I said. "Funding strangers' scholarships instead of calling your own kid." It was cowardice wearing a nicer coat, he admitted, meeting my eyes for the first time since he'd started talking. I know that now, sitting here. I didn't offer him instant forgiveness that day, and I want to be honest about that because I think too many of these stories rush toward a tidy reconciliation that real life rarely earns that quickly. What I offered him was a second meeting, then a third, slow and deliberately paced, each one a little less guarded than the last, small pieces of trust extended cautiously and only once the previous ones had held. We talked about logistics, too. Eventually, I asked whether continuing to rent from him felt strange to either of us, and he offered immediately to release us from the lease with no penalty. If I wanted to move elsewhere, no argument, no attempt to use the arrangement as leverage to stay connected. I told him I'd think about it, and ultimately decided to stay, partly because the apartment itself had become genuinely comfortable, and partly because some part of me wanted to see whether this strange, accidental reconnection was something worth continuing to test. My mother has not been ready to speak with him again, and I've told him plainly that I won't push her toward something she doesn't want, that her healing and mine don't have to move at the same pace or toward the same destination. He accepted that without argument, which itself told me something about who he'd actually become in the years since he left, a man who'd apparently learned somewhere along the way how to sit with a boundary instead of pushing against it. 6 months later, Gregory and I have something that isn't quite a relationship in the traditional sense, but isn't nothing either: occasional dinners, a cautious, evolving correspondence, an understanding that trust once broken, that thoroughly rebuilds in inches rather than leaps. He still owns the building. Ray still handles most of our maintenance requests now, at Gregory's own insistence, a small, deliberate boundary neither of us needed to discuss out loud. a professional distance he built himself without me having to ask for it. I think about that afternoon often, the absurdity of it, 22 years of silence broken not by a letter, not by a phone call, but by a leaking dishwasher and an emergency contact field neither of us thought twice about filling out. I don't know if I'd call it fate exactly. I think it's closer to what happens when two lives that were never fully finished with each other eventually inevitably find some accidental seam where they overlap again, whether either person is ready for it or not. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever collided by pure accident with someone whose absence shaped you more than their presence, ever did tell me what that reckoning looked like for you, I want to know we're not alone in this. My father spent 22 years as a fact about my childhood instead of a person in my present, and it took one broken dishwasher, one overlooked name on a lease application, and one very uncomfortable afternoon in my own kitchen to finally turn him back into both. I don't share this story looking for a tidy lesson about forgiveness, because I'm still not entirely sure I've landed on one myself. What I do know is that the version of closure I actually got wasn't the one I would have written if I'd been asked to imagine it in advance. No letter, no dramatic phone call, just an ordinary Thursday afternoon and an appliance repair that happened to crack open 22 years of silence I'd stopped expecting anyone to ever address. Sometimes reckonings arrive exactly like that, unglamorous and unannounced, whether you're ready for them or not.